Has social media, do you think, in a way, radicalized? And I use the word in its mildest sort of vanilla context, certain MPs. What I mean is, do some MPs now deliberately reach for the short, sharp thing that they think might become a viral little video? Because they do attack each other on that basis. I've seen loads of MPs going, oh, well done, well, you got your Twitter video for the day. And so they must be aware of it, right?
Yeah, I think there is. I think quite often we see people do something stunty in the comments and we think, that was for us. that was for us. For example, Dawn Butler, when she was chucked out the Commons for calling Boris Johnson a liar, regardless of she was right. She was right to do it, but at the back of her mind, she would have been thinking, "This is going to be clip. I'm going to get some press for this." And I think, but then conversely, some of our best clips are just MPs being very good at their job. Like Darren Jones in select committees, he's kind of made a name for himself by holding big business chairs to account, and we've got like compilations on YouTube of hundreds of thousands of views of Darren Jones just being thorough and good at his job. Yvette Cooper as well, when she goes up against Suella Braverman. There's something to be said about a lot of the good content isn't overly performative, or because some MPs do DM Politics Joe on Twitter with a link to their speech, and you think that is the most boring thing I've ever seen. I've ever seen in your life. But I also think there's when MPs kind of do or clip their own stuff, they kind of forget they're no longer in control of the narrative of it, because there is that in the social element of it. People can reply, "You're a dickhead," and they don't like that. And so I think that they forget about the kind of the two-way element of it.
Seth, have politicians not always done that in a way? Aren't memes simply today's headlines? Wouldn't Churchill be sort of eminently memeable if he were around today?
Yes, and Churchill's a really good example of that, actually, because he actively cultivated and thought about his image. I mean, there are stories about him going off to make a speech and grabbing his cigar and his hat and saying, "Mustn't forget my props." Churchill used to smoke about 15 to 20 cigars a day, but he never smoked them for more than 2 or 3 minutes because he was very conscious of what he called being seen with a comically short cigar. So he was always being seen lighting up cigars, but he'd never actually smoked the whole thing.
That's hilarious.
And indeed, when he was being painted, he said to an artist, which are you going to do today, the bulldog or the cherub? He was very, very conscious of how that goes. And this goes really right back to, I think, the late 18th century. You start with someone like James Gillray, you move on to artists like Cruikshank and Rowlandson. They're caricaturing, and they're being relentless in their caricatures of politicians. But that has stayed with us. And if you think about particularly the prime ministers in history who come to mind, Pitt the Younger, Disraeli, Gladstone, Macmillan, Thatcher, they're all a gift to cartoonists. They really are. And they play that up to a certain element. I mean, you mentioned Dawn Butler earlier, and actually the master of that kind of thing was Dennis Skinner, with his parliamentary opposition things. He wasn't thinking in terms of memes, but he certainly was thinking, I'm building up a record of, raging in the corner and being angry about this. And we now have those compilation videos on YouTube of all the things where once a year on the Queen's speech, Dennis Skinner would say something pithy and short, which would make the evening news. So politicians do think in visual terms, and cartoonists can say things in visual terms. Not always good, it has to be said, but they can say things in that. And one really interesting point on this, actually, is how politicians have tried to control a lot of this, because we often overlook that the legislation from 1988, which allows them to televise Parliament, has very strict restrictions in place banning the use of parliamentary footage to this day for satirical or comedy purposes. And that is why you'll see politicians made fun of outside of the chamber. And I can think of loads of ridiculous things that have gone on in a chamber in full view of the cameras, and you never see that being mocked because it's still a criminal offence to do that.
Interesting. On what you said, social media has been around now for just over 2 decades. Are they training them a lot better? Because, I mean, despite the occasional gaffes, they seem to me to be more regimented than in the early days of Wild West social media, where loads of them got into trouble.
Yeah. It used to be the case that if you had a blog, you'd be someone like John Hemming or Tom Watson, who was considered a little bit geeky and a little bit weird, and also it would look really amateurish as a website. And those early cases really are almost a lesson in what not to do on the internet. Now, I think part of it is also, there's a tradition of buying brains in politics, but you also buy marketing and comms people to actually run these accounts for you. It's not always that slick, though, and it ultimately depends on whether the politician has enough sense to use it well. I mean, I'll give you one example, actually, which is when Rory Stewart was running for Mayor of London. He did his whole Rory Walks hashtag thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was quite good. It was interesting stuff about politicians connecting with people they don't normally connect with. But
a lot of it,
yes. Well, I was thinking
was
specifically
very easy to take the piss.
The thing where he's on the corner of Liverpool Street and he says, I met her a couple of minor gangsters. They weren't minor. There was nothing criminal. He was talking to two black men in Liverpool Street, and there was nothing remotely criminal about either of them.
Yasmeen, Labour's social media in the Corbyn years seemed a lot more switched on, actually. And I wonder, do you think that is a conscious choice? Has Starmer decided a more po-faced approach to online was the way to go because sort of seriousness and not getting involved with that stuff is sort of his thing?
I think that's part of it. I feel like he still has that prosecutor persona, the very serious. And I mean, I think if you think back to who the average Corbyn supporter was, I mean, I don't have the numbers, but I think like visually, you think of a lot of young people. I think Corbyn did tap into kind of like a very young sort of base. And where are young people? They're online. And Corbyn generally just seemed a bit more, kind of, not wearing a tie, a bit more approachable, a bit like, it didn't come off as too forced, I think, when he would do something like that. Whereas Starmer, when Time had our conversation with him in February, he told me very plainly, where I'm trying to appeal to people who didn't vote for us the last time. Now, if that's, older people who perhaps aren't online or on Facebook only, who live in the red wall, then, maybe you don't need to be quite as internet savvy as that. But also, I think fundamentally, to your point, it's just because he and Sunak, I think, are both kind of quite serious. Like, I couldn't see either of them trying to, like,
But Sunak is very sort of Vanity Fair little videos. He
I was thinking of the boots.
He definitely has an online marketing
That's true.
thing going on. But it seems to also backfire quite a lot with him. Like people watch it and they think, I don't want to see that. I don't buy this stuff of you in the, on a beach in the sunset with your golden retriever. It's a lie.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps part of the reason that we don't see Starmer doing that as much. I remember for the profile speaking to some friends of his who said that he can't really pretend to be something he's not.
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps why we're not seeing that side of him, because he just can't force it. And yet, does that make him perhaps less visible online? Yes, but does it also mean that people aren't making fun of his shoes or like, his trousers? I think someone was making fun of Sunak on Twitter, his tailoring.
Yeah.
Also true.
Okay.